Welcome back. Well, living in the northwest corner of the lower 48 states in the USA where there's plenty of water, I often pass by lakes and ponds and rivers, and I hardly give it a thought. Now, occasionally I might notice how clear the water is, or I might think how nice it would be to dive in and cool off on a hot day. Sometimes I think about fish, but rarely do I think about the little tiny microscopic things in the water that we don't ordinarily see. Now, if I took a drop of pond water and placed it on a slide and examined it through a microscope, I'd see plenty of amazing things that I'm ordinarily oblivious to. Through the help of lenses and a microscope, people have gained levels of understanding and appreciation for things that were never fully understood before the microscope was invented back in the late 16th century. Now, in this course, we've been using some basic tools to look at things in ways that pass many other people by today. And in using tools like the Integration Conversation Starter or the Truth and Baloney Detector, students and teachers and parents or pastors for that matter, it can talk about things in ways that may elude others or ways that people don't ordinarily think about. Now, as followers of Christ, we can see things in a holistic way by taking the big picture into account, viewing the smaller things of life in the context of the larger whole. That's what biblical worldview integration is all about. Now, if we do not take the full picture into consideration, we're going to end up with just a portion of the true meaning of things, or we may miss the true meaning altogether. Now, in this session, I'd like to share another tool with you that will increase meaning. This particular tool I have found to be very helpful for viewing the things in life that go wrong. And when we're faced with a problem, when we're confronted with a crisis or a serious irritation or simply dealing with a very troubling question, this tool can be extremely helpful for a follower of Christ. It can be used in your life as a teacher or an administrator, or if you're a pastor or a parent, it can be used in your life just as well. And of course, we want it to be used in the lives of students who are dealing with problems on the playground or maybe on a part-time job after school. And I call this tool the Biblical Worldview Finder. Now, some of you might be asking, what does this have to do with education? Well, from a holistic vantage point, Christian education is more than learning how to spell or how to solve a math problem or how to become a good reader, although those things are important. Holistic Christian education has to do with the whole of life. This is the very nature of holistic Christian education. Now, before I share with you the mechanics of this tool, I want to lay a bit of groundwork. Now, in the previous sessions, I've described the concept of a worldview as the way a person conceives of God, creation, humanity, moral order, and purpose. These 5 worldview components provide convenient mental hooks to hang our thoughts on. Now, when we are comparing the biblical worldview with other worldviews, like with the Truth and Baloney Detector, these 5 components really are quite handy for comparative purposes. Or if we're trying to make connections between the biblical worldview and any academic subject that we're dealing with in school, like when you're using the Integration Conversation Starter, those 5 components of a biblical worldview are very, very helpful for organizing our thoughts. Now, a variety of tools in your toolkit is really important. So I want to present another angle for thinking about how the biblical worldview causes us or enables us to see things differently than we would without that bigger picture. And this other angle that I want to talk about here is a common angle for discussing biblical worldview, and that is the angle of discussing it or seeing it in terms of a four-part narrative, namely creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. Now, this way of thinking about biblical worldview was really made fairly popular in the 1960s and 70s through the work of Francis Schaeffer. Although he wasn't the first to think about biblical worldview in this way, he did popularize it. Now, this way of seeing worldview has also been used by many others, including Chuck Colson and Nancy Pearcey, who wrote How Now Shall We Live, which was one of the most popular books on worldview that came out in the 90s. And Daryl Miller uses this approach in his book Life Work, which is required for this class, and I also use this approach as well. But whether we use the approach that identifies four parts of a grand narrative like creation, fall, redemption, restoration, or whether we approach worldview as a big picture with five components, God, creation, humanity, moral order, and purpose, the principle of integrating particular things into the context of a larger picture or a larger narrative, the principle is the same. This principle, whether it's applied to the picture or the story, is based on the premise that our interpretation of smaller pieces is influenced by our concept of the larger whole. So, remember this? Of course you do. You're probably tired of seeing it by now. But whether you see this as a foothill behind a farm or as a banana will largely be determined by your concept of the bigger picture or the larger story, you might say, or the probability structure, as some people call it. Well, as I mentioned earlier, the Biblical Worldview Finder is a tool that's particularly useful in connection with stress-producing issues or problematic challenges or difficult questions. It's a practical way to put these challenges of life into the larger context. And when we do this, those challenges look different than they did before. And the tool I'm talking about is a template that looks like this. For the creation part of the grand story or the grand meta-narrative, the Biblical Worldview Finder mentions four representative statements. Number one, the entire universe was spoken into existence by the designer-creator's willing choice. Secondly, God caused all things to first appear, and he continuously sustains all things throughout the present. And number three, the creator-sustainer is a personal being. And number four, men and women are specially created in the likeness and image of God, which sets us apart from animals and gives us a basis for intrinsic value and inherent worth. Now, there are a lot more statements that could be included in the creation part of the story, but these four statements are sufficient for the purposes of this tool. Romans 1:20 says, "For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead. We also know that God is not a human being, and humans are not deities, yet both God and humans share this commonality. We're both personal beings, capable of abstract reason and also capable of original creativity. Now, in this respect, we bear God's image or his likeness as no animal does. And in the person of Jesus, God took on the form of a human being and became fully man and fully God at once. Now in Genesis, God said, "Let us make man in our image according to our likeness. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them." Now, when it speaks of "let us make man," that's a reference to the Trinity and the triune nature of our God. Now, even after Adam and Eve fell out of right relationship with God, they sinned, even after that, God affirmed that humans still have unique value as image bearers of God. This is clear from a number of scriptures, but Genesis 9 tells us when Noah and his family came out of the ark after the flood, that God spoke to Noah and said, "Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made man." What this tells us is a person's worth does not start when he or she comes to faith in Christ. People have intrinsic value before they come to Christ, not because they come to Christ. People have intrinsic value because even while in their broken, fallen condition, they bear God's likeness and image. That's the tragedy of the fall. The Bible says Christ loved us and died for us while we were yet sinners. Now, this is why every person we come in contact with is worthy of profound respect, no matter what their worldview is, regardless of their behavior. Now, that's always a good thing for teachers to remember. Being made in the likeness and image of God is the determining factor of your students' dignity. And this factor is what sets students apart from animals. It sets people of all ages as far apart from the ape as from the ant or a plant. This really is what having intrinsic value and inherent worth is all about. It applies to every human being, even those kids that are particularly irritating. Now, as for the fall part of the larger narrative, the Biblical Worldview Finder has two representative statements. Statement number 5 says, God has set in place non-optional, non-negotiable moral laws for our good. And when we disregard them, we hurt ourselves and others. And then statement number 6 says, since the fall, human beings have experienced an internal problem with sin, a natural bent to go our own way rather than God's way, and to be a law unto ourselves. Now, as for the redemption part of the grand narrative, the Biblical Worldview Finder has two statements. Statement number 7 says, at the cross, Christ took upon himself the sins of the human race in order to bridge the relational gap between us and God, and to provide a way of redemption through personal faith in his finished work. And then statement number 8, genuine freedom is the internal self-control that comes from self-government under God through the enablement of the Holy Spirit, regardless of the circumstances. And then finally, in the restoration part of the narrative, the Biblical Worldview Finder includes 4 statements. We live in a fallen world, which is not the way it was originally made to be, but we do not live in a forsaken world. Next, the earth and everything in it remains God's own possession, and therefore it has great significance. Next, the first commission given by God to humanity is to govern over all the earth. And finally, God seeks to do his will on earth as it is in heaven, and by his grace he will work through redeemed people to bring his light to every sphere of life. Now, once again, let me say that there are many more statements that could be made in reference to creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. But for the purposes of this tool, these 12 really are sufficient. Now, as with the other tools that I've talked about, the format of the Biblical Worldview Finder is really quite simple, but the application of the tool does take some reflective thought. And let me underscore that the Biblical Worldview Finder really is not a substitute for prayer. It's not a substitute for counsel from trusted advisors. It's not a fix-all formula. It's simply a thought prompter. And the basic idea, again, is to put a particular challenge or question or issue into the context of the creation, fall, redemption story by considering how each of these 12 statements casts light on whatever particular challenge, question, or issue you're putting in the center of that larger story. Now, your students might find this tool helpful when they don't get a part they wanted in the school play, when they don't make the cheerleader squad, or when someone else is chosen for the first string on the sports team, or when they don't get the recognition they think they deserve. And it can also be used in the case of relational challenges that come up between students, or even family members or people that they work with or play with on the weekend. Now, not all 12 statements in the viewfinder have equal relevance to all challenges. Some statements will have more relevance than others depending on the nature of the particular problem. Now, to give you a feel for how this tool works, I'd like you to first go to session 9 in the course content area of the online distance learning platform and print out a copy of the Biblical Worldview Finder. And put this presentation on pause for a moment to do that now. Now, with the Biblical Worldview Finder in front of you as a reference, I'd like you to watch a short video clip about a man named Ivan. It's a true story. Ivan was faced with a particular challenge at work that was quite negative. And I want you to notice that I'm using an adult example. Now, while the objective here is to have your students learn how to use this tool for their own challenges, I really think it's incumbent upon us as teachers to be authentic and to be able to apply the tool to ourselves before teaching it to our students. If you learn to use it for yourself, consider how you can come up with a real example that you can use with whatever age group you're dealing with. And as with the other tools, those of you who are dealing with very young children, you'll have to adapt some of the language to an age-appropriate level. So, Ivan runs into a big snag at work. Here's the story.
Sometimes, Ivan thought, the scales of justice needed a little help from the thumb, like when it came to his expense account. Ivan felt he'd been unfairly passed over for promotion. He'd invested a lot of time in the company, especially when his children were younger. He had paid his dues and more. He felt he deserved more recognition, or perhaps something extra. That extra came on his frequent trips. In some cities, he'd stay with friends, but charge the firm. He'd take relatives out for luxurious dinners and let the company pay. Once or twice he added an extra leg onto a sales trip so he could visit his daughter at college. He found other ways to divert company money into his own pocket. Since Ivan was trusted, no one ever checked. Ivan felt the company owed him. At church, he looked Evelyn, owner of the firm, straight in the eye without guilt. Two co-workers were furious when they caught on. Unlike Ivan, they weren't professing Christians. In fact, they resented the religious talk around the office. They felt Ivan in particular was self-righteous. The spiritual tone of the office sometimes made them feel second class. When news of Ivan's misdeeds found its way to Evelyn, she was livid. She felt betrayed, not only by a trusted employee, but also by a fellow believer who had sat with her on church boards. Moreover, the company's testimony had been compromised, and the office atmosphere poisoned. My immediate reaction was clear-cut, Evelyn recalls. He's got to go. Ivan has to be made an example of. I felt let down. I thought I'd be perceived as a wimp if I didn't act decisively.
Now, the challenge we all have as followers of Christ is to see life in light of the rest of the story, in light of the bigger picture of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. So the question now is, how does the creation, fall, redemption, and restoration story cast light on Ivan's situation? If Ivan had stood back and viewed his situation in the context of the bigger story, how might this have helped him to respond differently than he did? I'd like you to consider the first statement in the creation part of the viewfinder, which says the entire universe was spoken into existence by the designer-creator's willing choice. This could have helped Ivan to realize that life is not about him. It's about the one who made him. God is the potter, Ivan is the clay. And it might have helped Ivan to remember this. And it also might have helped him to remember that if God is big enough to create the universe, he's big enough for this issue at work. Now, the second statement in the creation part of the story says that God caused all things to first appear, and he continuously sustains all things throughout the present. If Ivan had just thought about this a bit, he might have remembered that God is sustaining him, giving him his next breath, in spite of this negative development in his life. The world did not fall apart because Ivan was overlooked, and that should tell him something. And also, God is sustaining Ivan's boss's breath. Both are being sustained for a purpose that is greater and grander than either one of them. It's good to think about those things once in a while. Now, the third creation statement is that the creator-sustainer is a personal being. This could have reminded Ivan that God can relate to his pain. Because God can relate to his pain, God can be a source of personal help to him. The Lord is someone who was tempted in all ways as Ivan was, and the Lord is someone that Ivan can talk to about this problem. God understands his pain. He's someone that Ivan can reason with about it and even express his frustrations to. And King David did this very often. Well, I'd like you to put this presentation on pause. I'd like you to go through the rest of the 12 statements of the viewfinder on your own with reference to Ivan's issue. I want you to think about each particular statement and how it relates to Ivan's challenge of being passed over for a promotion. And remember, some statements on the viewfinder relate more directly to Ivan's situation than other statements do. But some of these statements have a very profound and strong connection with Ivan's situation. Now, if you are personally going through a very difficult situation right now in your own life, I'd like you to put this presentation on pause and go through this exercise relating it to your own situation. That might be of more benefit to you than going through Ivan's situation. But you take your choice. At any rate, take time to reflectively think about how each of these 12 statements in the viewfinder can help you, or could have helped Ivan, to get perspective on the challenge, the crisis, or the question that's facing either you or Ivan. Now, although there's not a specific assignment in this course related to the Biblical Worldview Finder, I hope that you will use it, and not only that it will be helpful during your own times of pain, but that you will share this tool with your students, and that you will help them to think through more holistically about life in general. Remember, holistic Christian education is not just about academics. It's about seeing all things through that lens, through that grid, and seeing how everything relates to the bigger picture of God's world. And as with the other tools that I'm giving you in this course, the aim of the Worldview Finder is that students will be able to think holistically, and they'll be able to dispense with the so-called sacred-secular split. All of these tools are meant to be aids in recovery from secularized thought. It takes repeated practice because most of us, including myself, have a strong tendency to fall back to the default mode of our secularized culture. It would have been a lot easier for us to think holistically in the days of Comenius or Jonathan Edwards, but we're not there. We have to work at this a little more intentionally than they did. And ridding ourselves of SSD, the sacred secular divide, is not a quick and easy fix. It takes time and repeated effort to form new thought habits. Gnostic dualism is not an easy thing to dispense with. And I want to give a little footnote here, particularly for those of you with a background in philosophy. Now, if you don't have a background in philosophy, you can plug your ears just for a moment. But don't go away, because I have something really important to share with all of you before we wrap up this session. Well, my footnote for philosophy majors or philosophy junkies is simply to say that when I speak of dispensing with dualism, I'm not at all referring to what is known in the field of philosophy as substance dualism. I'm referring to Gnostic dualism. Substance dualism is the understanding that the substance of a human being is body and soul. This is the biblical view of humanity. Many verses affirm the idea that we are more than simply physical creatures. We are physical and spiritual beings. The human mind is part of the soul, and it's not merely chemical reactions in physical gray matter that we call the brain. And when we die, our soul departs from our body. Later we get a new body for our soul to inhabit, but the body is not the soul. The soul is not the body. Now, I'm not remotely suggesting that we dispense with the idea of substance dualism in the philosophic sense of that idea. The dual nature of humans with a body and a soul is how we were created. And as God said, it was very good. Now, to suggest, as some do today, that human beings are only physical, to me that's as misguided as to suggest that human beings are only spiritual. These are two kinds of monism that are the outcome of either the Western worldview of materialism that says all that exists is matter and it denies the soul, or the Eastern worldview of pananimism, which says all that exists is spirit. The dualism that I'm suggesting we dispense with is the Gnostic dualism that divorces the body from the soul or denies the goodness of the body and the goodness of the physical realm of creation. Gnostic dualism separates our public lives from our so-called private faith. It divorces facts from values. It disconnects math from the maker of math, and it detaches God from science, and it splits life into so-called sacred and secular compartments. And once again, to make myself clear, I'm not remotely suggesting that we dispense with the philosophic and biblical idea of substance dualism that sees humans as made up of body and soul. I also want to make it clear that I'm not questioning metaphysical dualism. Now, it should be obvious to everyone watching that I'm not advocating materialism in any way, shape, or form. Metaphysical dualism is central to the biblical worldview. It's the belief that reality is made up of both physical and metaphysical things. This isn't the kind of dualism that I'm opposed to, of course. God's world is made up of both the seen and the unseen. And the unseen realm includes a whole array of metaphysical realities, including angels, both fallen and not. And it includes the afterlife. Again, it's the idea of Gnostic dualism that we need to dispense with, not the idea of substance dualism or metaphysical dualism. A holistic approach to life really validates both the physical and the metaphysical realms, and it unifies them in Christ, the common creator and sustainer of both. He's out to do his will in the physical realm as it is done in the metaphysical realm. And in Christ, these realms are made whole. Now, if you're not a philosophy junkie, I've probably thoroughly confused you, so let's move on. Well, I'd like to make a very important observation about the true story of Ivan. It appears from what was written about Ivan's situation in the book where I found the story, Ivan did not share his pain with another believer. He seemed to go it alone. In Ecclesiastes 4, 9 through 12, we read, "Two are better than one because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. Also, if two lie down together, they will keep warm. How can one keep warm alone? Though one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken." I invite you to take out a clean piece of paper and write the following at the top. My personal board of directors. Now, in the middle of the piece of paper, I'd like you to draw an oval to represent a conference room table. And I'd like you to print your own name at one end of the table. And then around this table, I'd like you to print the names of others who currently influence you the most in a positive way. They may be living or deceased. They may be people that you've never met, such as authors or media personalities or sports figures or musicians. These are the voices you turn to, you listen to, you learn the most from. These are the voices you take seriously when you want counsel, or ideas, or motivation, or companionship, or guidance, or you want a boost of confidence. I'd like you to limit the number of board members to 6 or 7, and put this presentation on pause and give yourself some time to really think this through. Now I'd like you to write a short description by each name that you've put around the table. A short description that identifies the basic reason why he or she is on your personal board of directors. For example, he always makes time for me, or she never makes me feel like my ideas won't work. Again, put this presentation on pause and spend some time thinking about this. Now, when you're through watching this presentation, sometime in the next 24 hours, I recommend that you write a short personal note to each member of your personal board of directors, the living ones, that is, thanking them and letting them know that they are on your personal board of directors and why they're there. I was first taught this great exercise by my friend Dr. Kathy Cook, who's the founder of Celebrate Kids Incorporated. And with her permission, I've shared this exercise with many people. Several of my own personal board of directors have been around my conference table for more than 30 years. My wife has been on my board for over 40 years. What a difference these people have made and continue to make in my life. They are the friends I cannot afford to live without. And along these lines, I'd like to recommend a really good book by Tom Rath called Vital Friends, The People You Can't Afford to Live Without. It's a great read. It will really help you to recognize who's on your personal board of directors. And, just as importantly, it will help you to be a good board member for those around you who look to you for advice or moral support. Well, who's on your personal board of directors? Maybe you can't limit it to 6 or 7. Get a bigger piece of paper. Thank them. You'll be glad you did, and you'll be encouraged. And they will be encouraged as well. One more question. Is Jesus on your personal board of directors? He's been on mine for over 50 years now, ever since I came to know him at the age of 8. And if you want to know how that happened, send me an email and I'll be happy to explain it to you. But before we conclude this session, I'd like to give you a positive example of a person who was able, by God's grace, to respond rightly to a negative aspect at work, and he was able to put the sacred secular divide behind him. The man's name is Jack Van Hardesveld. Now, in this case, Jack was experiencing a challenge that's not uncommon for followers of Christ in the workplace today. He was doing things that were legally okay, but not really in alignment with the kingdom of God, not really ethical. Jack was doing business in a way that was commonly accepted, yet as a follower of Christ, it troubled him, and it should have. Well, these sorts of situations can be highly stressful for followers of Christ in the workplace. But as we put this sort of thing into the framework of a bigger picture, a biblical worldview context, these kinds of situations take on a whole new dimension. Let's hear Jack's story as he tells it himself.
Well, when I first started out in this business, it was the trick was to figure out a way to do it well, and the amount of money that's being at issue is, in the beginning it was $5 to $10 million. Now it's several hundred million per transaction. So anytime you have a situation where that much money is involved, just the roundings could be millions. And people fight very hard in order to protect their interests. What happens in the beginning, I think, is that they try to figure out a way to be smarter than you. And they try to outsmart you, figure that there's something that maybe you don't know that they know, and then they can trick you into agreeing to something that deprives you of your rightful gain from the transaction, whatever position you happen to be in at the time. And so in the beginning, in the early 80s when I was doing this, that seemed to me to be what the game was. And so I tried to just be good at that game. And I found out that I had an aptitude for this, and that after you do a few dozen of these transactions, it's a little bit harder to trick you. But come to find out, you could actually trick them. And I got to the point where I just didn't want to play that game anymore. What I really wanted to do is to tell people what I really wanted, and I thought that everybody that was involved in the transaction had some right to receive either a job or compensation or a commission or a contract to build something or whatever it is that they were bargaining for. If they were at the table in the first place, they hadn't disqualified themselves in some other way, that they ought to be able to get what they bargained for. I went to my employer. I actually went to my lawyers first after having done many transactions with this same group of lawyers, and I told them that I didn't want to play this game anymore. I wanted to just tell them what I really thought I deserved out of this transaction, and I recognized what they ought to get out of it, and that I was going to actually help them to protect their interests. Well, the lawyers became very upset about this and said that they would not represent me, that I worked for a public company at that time, and that I needed to go to the board of directors and tell them what I was going to do and get their permission. And if I didn't do that, then they weren't actually going to help me do this or even allow me to do it. So I did that. I went to the board and I asked them. I told them what I wanted to do and said I just wanted to play this completely straight, be honest on each of the points, and I wanted to put together fair documents that were fair for everybody. And they gave me permission to do it. And the first project that I did like that was in New Orleans. And this was in 1992. And there was a real estate kind of a collapse had gone on throughout the United States. The RTC had been formed, and the two people that I was dealing with to build this hotel were struggling financially, had gone through some threatened foreclosures and problems with their banks, problems with their partners, problems with some of their management companies, and they had developed a lot of kind of sharp edges. And in I walk at that point, having just met with my board. And so I said to them, here's the way we're going to do this. We already had sort of a letter of intent fleshed out. We're going to put together these documents. But here's the way it's going to go. I'm going to look out for you. And I want you to look out for me. Because I think you have a legitimate economic interest here. And there may be ways in which you could be deprived of those interests. But I'm not going to let that happen. Because I think that you deserve what you bargained for. And therefore, I'm going to help you. And I hope before it's all over that you help me to protect my interests. And I'll go first. And we started going through the agreements, and I went to a provision fairly early on, and I said, this is what this says, and it looks great because you're going to be the developer and you're supposed to make this money. And but if you flip in the back, this section here in the back, it looks like actually without doing something really bad, you could be deprived of that. I could do that. Now, I wouldn't deprive you of it, but legally I could. And maybe I'm not here at the time in which this gets triggered. And somebody could take this money away from you. And so what I'd like my lawyer to do, and I looked over at my lawyer, and I said, I would like that provision to be changed so that this unfair thing could not happen to them. And my lawyer was a little uncomfortable, but he didn't want to say anything. And he said, okay, fine, let's do that. And the guys at the other side of the table, they didn't really know what to make of this. But they said, great, thank you. And we moved on. And about a half hour later, we came across another one, and they were ready to turn the page. And I says, before we turn the page, if you look here in the middle, this provision here, that ties over to this other agreement over here, and which has a mirror provision. But actually, if you don't do this exactly right, exactly perfectly, you won't get this other compensation that would come to you under certain circumstances. And I don't think that that's fair, because you would trigger this just too easily. It's not right. And I want to change it so that it is fair. Well, that started to really get to him. And as we went on over the period of the next several days going through these agreements, I kept doing that whenever I could. And when things would come up that really hadn't been resolved, we debated them, and I would say, well, this is what would be fair for me. Now, what would be fair for you? And as we kind of articulated it, I took their position and also my own. And we just kind of looked at it from a 360-degree view and what would be the right thing for all of us in this situation. Well, it blew them away. we were able to conclude the transaction, and everybody felt great about it. We built the hotel, and for $25 million, they brought it in on time and on budget, which was great. 2 years later, we sold it for $45 million. We made a $20 million profit, and they got half. And that transaction saved them financially. They also told me later that it changed the way they did business. One of the two of them, I thought, really kind of got it as we were going through it, and one of them I didn't think did. Well, some years later, we decided to do another project together, same two guys. And one of the fellas there, the one that I thought probably didn't get what I was doing, he was being honored that day as being New Orlean of the Year. And finally, it was his turn to say thank you or whatever. And he stood up to the microphone that was in front of him, and he turned to the audience, the people who were there, and he pointed to me, and he said, "Jack, would you please come and sit next to me?" So I didn't really want to do that. This was not about me. This was not my moment. This was his moment. But for some reason, he wanted me to do it, and so I did. I walked up and I sat next to him. And he looked at the people and he said, "Thank you very much for all your kind words." He said, "But I am not the one that you should be honoring here today. You should be honoring this man sitting next to me." And he pointed to me. And he went on to say some of the nicest things that anybody has ever said to me. I can't repeat it, but he thanked me. He thanked me. They were saying, "It's you, sir," him. And when it's his turn to talk, he said, "It's not me, it's him." And he referenced specifically the things that I had done and the way it had affected him. Sometimes people don't get what you're doing right away. But it's not always about right now. Sometimes it takes people a while to get it. And the hard part is to not fall prey to that. Don't make your ethics become situational, where he's a bad guy, therefore I have the right to be a bad person. Don't do that. What you do is you have your own ethics, your own moral compass, and you just stay with that. You are looking out for their legitimate business interests. And that doesn't mean that you're Santa Claus and that you don't make money, because we do. I mean, we do very well here. But what happens is that we're not mired down in litigation. We're not struggling through fractured relationships. We are able to resolve things with phone calls. I don't have to call my lawyer to straighten things out. People kind of get it, and they will generally reflect back to you what you are showing to them.
Was there something that happened in your life where you decided you didn't want to do it the normal way and you wanted to do it this other way? What caused this to happen?
Well, when I was a teenager, I thought that I would go into the ministry, become a pastor of a church. That was kind of my path. And then my father died when I was a teenager. And that sort of changed things. I thought I had to make money, which I did, to support myself and my family, my mother and my sister. And I put myself through school by working. And all of those ethics and morals were still there. They're still ingrained within me. And as I began to develop in my career, I found myself not always following those morals and ethics. And it bothered me. It always bothered me. It got to the point where I just didn't want to do that anymore. I wanted to bring what we were talking about and listening to on Sunday morning, I wanted to bring to Monday morning and Tuesday morning and Wednesday morning. I wanted to live more of my life in that ethical structure, that spiritual understanding. And the interesting thing is, though, is that there is no penalty that you pay. It's better. You do better. You don't do worse. That's the joke of it. There's no penalty. It's easier. You actually make more money. Your business booms. I mean, I don't know why I don't know why everybody doesn't do this. What happened? Yeah, it's human nature to be maybe a little bit manipulative and, and trying to outsmart the other guy. Your ego gets involved and you don't want to look like an idiot and all this kind of stuff. And it forces you into behavior and it's reinforced by everybody else's behavior. But man, as soon as you stop doing that and you just go out and do the right thing, it works.
Jack's story illustrates biblical worldview integration at its finest and its holistic Christian thought at its best. It also illustrates what could happen in a society at large if a holistic Christian view of vocation were to be practiced in the world by believers who are already sprinkled like salt through the entire spectrum of society in the workplace. I believe it could turn our culture upside down in short order. Holistic Christian education is education that equips students to make the kind of life choices that cut through the Gnostic dualism that really cripples so many of us today. We really need a nation of people like Jack Van Hardesveld. And to get there, I suggest we be far more intentional about motivating Christian students to think holistically about vocation. I believe this can and should start in kindergarten. And in the next session, I'd like to take a good look at some practical steps that you can take to help restore a holistic view of vocation in the K-12 curriculum. I'd like you to look at some practical steps that will really be helpful for the next generation in seeing their work as holy ground. I'll see you then.